Section 32 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2, Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 2. French Navigators, 2e. Upon the 16th of May the vessels left the port and made for a strait, afterwards named after D'Entrecasteaux. Monsieur Creton and Monsieur Auribeau, says the narrative, were encouraged to land by the sight of fires close to the shore. They had gone but a short distance when they came upon 4 natives, attending to 3 small fires, by which they were seated. They took to flight on seeing the strangers, in spite of every friendly demonstration, leaving the lobsters and shellfish which they had been broiling. As many huts as there were fires were close by. One of the natives, in his hurry, left a small basket, full of pieces of silica, behind him. He was not afraid to return in search of it, but approached Creton with a bold air, possibly owing to his confidence in his own strength. Some of these savages were naked, and others wore only a kangaroo skin upon the shoulders. In colour they were nearly black, they had woolly hair and allowed the beard to grow." Upon leaving D'Entrecasteaux Strait, the vessels proceeded to survey the south-western coast of New Caledonia, which La Perouse should have visited. A portion of Pine Island, which stretches to the north of that country, was the first to be recognized. The Recherche narrowly escaped destruction upon the coral reefs which surround the coast, leaving only a narrow passage between them and the main land. At the northern extremity several mountainous islands and detached rocks were perceived, which rendered the navigation extremely dangerous. The navigators, grateful for their escape, named them the Entrecasteaux Reefs and Juan Islands. The survey of this perilous coast lasted from the 16th of June to the 3rd of July. A true service was thus rendered to geographers and navigators, though it was, perhaps, the least profitable part of the voyage of discovery. As the favourable season was now approaching, D'Entrecasteaux determined to avail himself of it to reach the land of the Arsacides, which had been seen by Surville, and visited some years later by Shortland, who, imagining he was making a new discovery, named it New Georgia. Upon the 9th of July, says Billardier, "towards half past 4 o'clock, we perceived, about 10 miles to the northwest, a rock called Eddystone. We took it at first, as Shortland had done, for a sailing vessel. The illusion was the greater, as in colour it much resembles the sails of a ship. A few shrubs crowned the summit. The land of the Arsacides, opposite this rock, is steep and covered with large trees." After rectifying the position of Eddystone Rocks, and that of the Treasury Islands, which are 5 in number, though so close together that Bougainville took them for one island, D'Entrecasteaux coasted Bougainville Island. It is separated from Bouka Island by a narrow strait, and is covered with plantations. It appeared to be well populated. Some trade was done with the natives, but nothing would induce them to venture on board the vessels. "The colour of their skins," says La Billardier, "is nearly black. They are of medium height, and wear no clothes. They are muscular and strong. Although their features are not pleasant, they are very expressive. They have large heads and broad foreheads. Their faces, especially in the lower part, are flat. They have thick chins, rather prominent cheekbones, flat noses, large mouths, and thin lips. Their ugliness is increased by the colour with which the betel nut stains their mouths. They appear very skilful in the use of bows and arrows. One of them brought a gannet, which he had just killed, on board, and the hole made by the arrow could easily be seen. These natives have bestowed particular attention upon their weapons, which are all very well finished. We could not but admire the skill with which they coated the strings of their bows with resin, in such a way that at first sight they looked like catgut. The centre was protected with a piece of bark, to lessen the wear in projecting the arrows." The survey of the western coast of these two islands was completed upon the 15th of July. Bougainville had already surveyed the eastern shore. Next day the French navigators sighted first the island to which Carteret had given the name of Sir Charles Hardy, and then the southeastern extremity of New Ireland. The two vessels cast anchor in Carteret Bay, and the crews were established upon Coco Island. This island is covered with evergreen trees, which, in spite of the volcanic nature of the soil, grow vigorously. The cocoanuts from which it received its name were procured with difficulty. On the other hand, it afforded the naturalists so many varieties of plants and insects as to charm Billardière. Rain fell abundantly during the stay. It was like a ceaseless torrent of tepid water. After obtaining the necessary food and water, the Recherche and Espérance set sail from Port Carteret upon the 24th of July, 1792. In so doing, the Espérance unfortunately lost an anchor, the cable having been cut by the coral reefs. The two vessels then entered St. George's Strait, which at the southern extremity is only about 42 miles in width, about half the extent assigned to it by Carteret. The currents were so rapid that the ships were carried past Man and Sandwich Islands without being able to stop. After sighting Portland Islands, low lands, 7 in number, which stretch from 2 degrees 39 minutes 44 seconds south latitude to 147 degrees 15 minutes east longitude, D'Entrecasteaux continued his route towards the Admiralty Islands, which he intended to visit. It was upon the most easterly of these islands that, according to the report received by Commodore Hunter, the natives wearing French naval uniforms had been seen. The natives appeared in crowds, says the narrative. Some ran along the shore, others, fixing their eyes upon our vessels, invited us by signs to land. The cries they uttered were intended to express their joy. At 1:30 the vessels anchored, and a boat was despatched from each, containing articles for distribution among the natives of this small island. The frigates were so placed as to protect the boats as they neared the land, in the event of any attack by the savages, for our recollection of the treachery of the natives of the islands south of the Admiralty made us distrustful." The coast abounded in reefs. The boats could only approach within 100 yards of the shore. Numbers of the natives crowded to the beach and invited the French by signs to land. "One of the savages, distinguished by a double row of small shells upon his forehead, appeared to exercise a good deal of authority. He ordered one of the natives to jump into the water and bring us some cocoanuts. Fearing to approach strangers swimming and defenseless, he hesitated for a moment. The chief, evidently quite unaccustomed to resistance to his wishes, followed up his command by blows from his club, and compelled obedience. As soon as the islander returned to land, curiosity brought the natives around him in crowds. Each wished to participate in our presents. Pirogues were immediately launched, and many natives swam to the boats, which were shortly surrounded by quite a crowd. We were surprised that the violence of the surf upon the breakers did not intimidate them." Perhaps the French may have attempted that which the Indians accomplished. It seems probable that they would never have observed these people if the vessels, or at least a small boat, had not been wrecked in the archipelago. The only remark made by them is to the effect that the natives understood and appreciated the use of iron. D'Entrecasteaux then proceeded to reconnoitre the northern portion of the archipelago, and to trade with the natives. He did not land anywhere, and does not appear to have executed this part of his task with the minute care and attention which might have been expected of him. The Recherche and the Espérance afterwards visited the Hermit Islands, discovered in 1781 by a Spanish frigate, La Princesa. The natives, like all those they had encountered, showed a great desire to induce the strangers to land, but did not succeed in persuading them to do so. The Exchequer Islands, discovered by Bougainville, several unknown low islands, covered with luxuriant vegetation, Schouten Island, and the coast of New Guinea, were successively sighted. In the interior of the last named a large chain of mountains was distinguished, the loftiest of which appeared at least 3,500 feet high. After coasting this large island, the Recherche and the Espérance entered Pitt Strait to reach the Moluccas. Upon the 5th of September, 1792, the French joyfully anchored in the roadstead of Amboyna. There were many sufferers from scurvy on board, and officers and crew alike needed a lengthened rest. The naturalists, astronomers, and other scientific men immediately landed, and took the necessary steps for the prosecution of their various observations. The naturalists were particularly successful in acquiring new facts. La Billardière congratulates himself upon the multiplicity of new plants and animals that he was able to obtain. Once when upon the shore, he says, "I heard what appeared to be wind instruments, the tones now harmonious, now discordant, yet never unpleasing. These harmonious and distinct sounds appeared to come from a distance, and I imagined the natives were making music some 6 or 7 miles beyond the roadstead. But my ear deceived me, for I found that I was not 100 yards from the instrument. A bamboo cane, at least 60 feet high, was fixed vertically upon the shore. At each notch a slit had been made, about 2½ inches long and 1 1/4 broad. These slits made so many openings for the wind, which, passing through them, produced varied and pleasant sounds. As the notches in this cane were very numerous, the slits had been made all round, so that whichever way the wind blew it went through some of them. I can only compare the sound of this instrument to that of an harmonium." During this long stay of a month in one place, the vessels were well caulked, the sails and rigging attended to, and every precaution taken for a voyage in tropical and damp climates. A few details on the roadstead of Amboyna, and the manners and customs of the native population, will not be out of place. "Amboyna roadstead," says La Billardière, "forms a channel some 13 or 14 miles in length, and about 2½ miles in breadth. It affords good anchorage, although the bottom is partly of coral. The fort, called Victory Fort, is built of bricks. The governor and some of the members of government reside there. It was at this time falling into ruins, and every discharge of cannon did evident damage. The garrison consisted of about 200 men, of which the natives of the island composed a considerable part. The remainder consisted of a few retired European soldiers and a small detachment of a Würtemberg regiment. The mortality amongst officers living in the Indies makes the lives of those who have been some time in the climate precious. The Dutch company is therefore seldom true to its promise to allow them to return to Europe at the expiration of their time of service. I met with several of these unfortunate men who had been detained for more than 20 years, when, according to agreement, they ought to have been freed long before. The language of the natives of Amboyna is Malay. It is very soft and musical. The country produces spices, coffee, which is inferior to that of Reunion Island, and sago. The latter is largely cultivated in the marshy districts. The rice consumed at Amboyna is not indigenous to the soil, but still it might be successfully cultivated in the lowlands. The Dutch company, however, prohibit the growth of this article of commerce, because its sale enables them to keep back a part of the sum which they are obliged to pay for cloves furnished by the blacks. They thus prevent the increase of pay, and obtain the fruits of native labour at a moderate price. Thus the company, consulting their own interest only, discourage all industry in the population, by forcing them, as it were, to relinquish everything but the cultivation of spices. The Dutch are careful to limit the cultivation of spices within the compass of ordinary consumption. Their efforts, which are destructive of all enterprise, chime in with the nonchalant character of the natives." On the 23rd of Vendémiaire of the year 1, if we conform to the new style, as Bougainville does, the two vessels left Amboyna, amply provisioned with fowls, ducks, geese, pigs, goats, potatoes, yams, bananas, and pumpkins. Meat, however, they obtained in but small quantities, The flour was of a bad quality, and the sailors could never accustom themselves to the sago which was shipped in its stead. Bamboos, cloves, and arrack may be added to the list of shipments. "Young bamboo shoots, cut in slices, and preserved in vinegar," says La Billardière, "made an excellent store for a long voyage. These young shoots are generally very tender. They are gathered early and sold in the market as vegetables, for which they are a good substitute. They are often a yard long and half an inch thick. These young bamboo shoots are much appreciated by the Chinese, who think them similar to asparagus in flavour. We were also provided with cloves and nutmegs preserved in sugar. The shell of the nutmeg is the only edible portion. Unfortunately, ignorant preservers have chosen full grown nutmegs. Cloves, when once as large as ordinary olives, retain too much flavour to be a pleasant sweetmeat. One must be endowed with an Indian palate to enjoy them. I might say the same of our ginger preserves. The only spirituous liquor obtainable was arrack, several casks of which were bought. Many travellers have spoken in praise of this liquor, which is, in reality, not equal to the poorest brandy." Upon leaving Amboyna, the expedition sailed for the south-west coast of Australia. Shortly afterwards, Kisser Island, the north shore of Timor, Baton Island, and the delightful Sauva Island, were successively passed; and finally, upon the 16th Frimaire, the western extremity of the south-western coast of New Holland, which was discovered by Leuwin in 1622, was sighted. The coast presented a succession of sandy dunes, in the midst of which arose pointed rocks, apparently utterly sterile. Navigation upon this unsheltered coast was extremely dangerous. The sea ran high, the wind was boisterous, and it was necessary to steer amongst the breakers. During a strong gale the Espérance was nearly driven upon the coast, when one of the officers fortunately distinguished from the mainmast an anchorage, where, he declared, the ships would be in safety. "The safety of the two ships," says the narrative, "was due to this discovery, for the Recherche, after battling as long as she could against the storm, had been forced to tack about all night amidst these perilous breakers, hoping for a change of wind which would make it possible for her to reach the open sea, and must infallibly have perished. This bay, named Le Grand, after the able seaman who first discovered it, will always recall his invaluable service to the expedition." The islets surrounding this coast were reconnoitred by the navigators. A geographical engineer, named Richer, belonging to the Recherche, landing upon the mainland to make observations, lost his way, and only reached the vessels after 2 days' absence, nearly dead of fatigue and hunger. This small archipelago concluded the discoveries of Nuits. "We were surprised," says La Billardière, "at the exactitude with which the latitude had been determined by this navigator, at a time when instruments were very imperfect. The same remark applies to nearly all Leuwin's discoveries in this region." Upon the 15th Nivose, 31 degrees 52 minutes latitude and 129 degrees 16 minutes east longitude, Captain Juan de Kermadec informed D'Entrecasteaux that his rudder was injured, that he was obliged to limit his crew to 3/4 of a bottle of water per day, that he had been forced to discontinue the distribution of anti-scorbutic drinks, and that he had only 30 casks of water remaining. The Recherche was hardly in better case. D'Entrecasteaux accordingly made for Cape Demon, after navigating for about 670 miles along a barren coast, which offered no object of interest or value. Upon the 3rd Pluviose, the vessels anchored in the Bay of Rocks, in Tempest Bay, which they had visited the preceding year. This spot was very rich in points of interest. La Billardière was amazed at the varied products of this portion of Van Diemen's Land, and was never tired of admiring the vast forests of gigantic trees, and the many unknown shrubs and plants, through which he had to force his way. During one of his numerous excursions he picked up some fine pieces of beautiful bronze red hematite, and further on some earth containing ochre, of so bright a red as to denote the presence of iron. He soon encountered some natives, and his remarks upon this race, which is now quite extinct, are interesting enough for repetition; moreover, they complete the particulars already given by Captain Cook. He says, "There were about 42 natives, 7 grown men, and 8 women, the others appeared to be their children. Many of them were girls already arrived at maturity, who were even more lightly clad than their mothers. They have woolly hair, and the men let their beards grow long. In the children the upper jaw projects, but in adults it is about even with the lower. No doubt these people consider it a beauty to be black; for, not being very dark to begin with, they powder the upper part of the body with coal dust. We noticed rows of spots on the skin, especially on the shoulders and breast, now in lines above 3 inches long, now in equidistant dots. These people do not appear to observe the custom which many travellers have thought to be universal amongst their tribes, of exacting the incisor teeth, for we saw no native with any missing from the upper jaw, and they all had very fine, strong teeth. These people swarm with vermin. We could not but admire the patience of a woman, whom we watched freeing her child of them; nor could we avoid feeling shocked when she crushed the disgusting insects with her teeth, and then swallowed them. Monkeys have the same habit. The young children greatly admired everything shining, and they did not hesitate to take the metal buttons off our coats. I must not omit to mention a trick played upon a sailor by a young savage. The man had collected a number of shells, and left them in a bag at the foot of a rock. The native furtively removed them, and allowed the sailor to search for them vainly for some time; then quietly replacing them, he seemed much amused at the trick he had played." Section 33. Section 33 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2, Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 2, French Navigators, 2f. Early in the morning of the 26th Pluviose, the two vessels weighed anchor, entered D'Entrecasteaux Strait, and, on the 5th of Ventose, anchored in Adventure Bay. After a stay of 5 days, spent in taking observations, D'Entrecasteaux set sail for New Zealand, and reached its southern extremity. After an interview with the natives, too short to admit of additions being made to the many and precise observations of Captain Cook, D'Entrecasteaux started for the Friendly Islands, which La Perouse had intended visiting. He anchored in Tonga Tabou Bay. The vessels were at once surrounded by a crowd of pirogues, and literally boarded by the natives, who came to sell pigs and every variety of fruit. One of the sons of Poulao, the king Cook had known, received the navigators cordially, and scrupulously superintended the trade with the islanders. This was no easy task, for they developed surprising talents for stealing everything which came in their way. La Billardière describes rather a good joke of which he was the victim. He was followed to the provision tent by 2 natives, whom he took to be chiefs. One of them, he says, "was very anxious to choose the best fruits for me. I had placed my hat on the ground, thinking it safe there; but these 2 rogues understood their business. The one behind me was clever enough to hide my hat under his clothes, and was off before I perceived the theft. The other speedily followed. I was the more surprised at this attempt, because I should have supposed they would not have had the courage to steal so large an object, running the risk of being caught, in the enclosure to which we had admitted them. Moreover, a hat could not be a very useful article to these people, who generally go bareheaded. Their dexterity in robbing me convinced me that it was by no means their first attempt." The French entered into relations with a chief named Finau, probably the same who is mentioned as Finauo in Captain Cook's voyage, and who called him Toutè. But he was only a secondary chief. The real king, supreme chief of Tongatabu, Vavau, and of Anamuka, was named Toubau. He visited the ships, and brought back a gun which had been stolen a day or two previously from a sentinel. He presented D'Entrecasteaux with 2 pieces of stuff made from the bark of the mulberry tree, so large that if opened out either would have covered the vessel. In exchange for mats and pigs he received a fine hatchet and a general's red coat, which he immediately put on. 2 days later an extraordinarily stout female, at least 50 years of age, and to whom the natives paid great respect, came on board. This was Queen Tina. She tasted everything that was offered to her, but preferred preserved bananas. The steward stood behind her chair and waited to clear away, but she saved him the trouble by appropriating the plate and napkin. King Toubau was anxious to give an entertainment to D'Entrecasteaux. The admiral was received upon landing by 2 chiefs, Finau and Omalai, and conducted by them to an extensive esplanade. Toubau arrived with his 2 daughters. They had sprinkled a quantity of cocoanut oil upon their heads, and each wore a necklace made of the pretty seeds of the Arbus pecatorius. "The natives," says the narrative, "arrived from all parts in great crowds. We estimated that the number amounted to at least 4,000. The seat of honour was evidently to the left of the king, for he invited D'Entrecasteaux to take his place there. The captain then offered the presents he had brought for the king, which were gratefully accepted. A piece of crimson damask excited the most vivid admiration from all the assembled natives. 'Eho! Eho!' they exclaimed repeatedly, in accents of the greatest surprise. They uttered the same admiring cry when we unfolded some pieces of coloured ribbon, in which red predominated. The captain then presented a couple of goats and a pair of rabbits, of which the king promised to take every care. D'Entrecasteaux also bestowed various presents upon Toubau's son Omalai, and several other chiefs. To our right, on the northeast, under a shady breadfruit tree laden with fruit, 13 musicians were seated, who sang together in different parts. 4 of the musicians played the accompaniment by striking bamboo canes, yard and a yard and a half long, upon the ground, the holder of the longest bamboo occasionally acting as conductor. These bamboo canes emitted a sound not unlike that of a tambourine, and they were arranged in the following order. The 2 medium-sized canes were in unison, the longest a tone and a half lower, and the shortest 2 tones and a half higher. The voice of the alto was heard far above all the others, although he was a little hoarse. He accompanied himself by striking with 2 little sticks upon a bamboo cane, some 6 yards long, and split throughout its entire length. 3 musicians stationed in front of the others appeared to explain the song by gestures, which had apparently been well studied, as they all acted in unison. Occasionally gracefully moving their arms, they turned towards the king, whilst sometimes they suddenly sunk their heads upon their breasts, and as suddenly tossed them back. After these entertainments Toubau offered the captain several pieces of stuff made from the bark of the mulberry tree. He had them unrolled with great ostentation, that we might fully appreciate the value of his gift. The minister seated upon his left ordered the preparation of kava, which was soon brought in an oval-shaped wooden vase, about 3 feet long. The musicians had reserved their best pieces for this moment, for at each succeeding effort we heard applauding cries of "Mali, Mali," and it was evident that the music had an agreeable and inspiriting effect upon the natives. The kava was then offered to the various chiefs by those who had prepared it." This concert, it will be seen, was by no means equal to the splendid entertainment which had been given to Captain Cook. Queen Tina followed it up by giving a grand ball, which was preceded by a concert, fully attended by the natives, amongst whom, we may incidentally mention, were numbers of thieves, who became so bold that they ended by forcibly taking possession of a cutlass. As the blacksmith of the Recherche pursued the thieves, they turned, and seeing him alone, struck him on the head with a club. Fortunately his danger was perceived by those on board the Espérance, and a well-directed shot dispersed his assailants. Several natives were killed upon this occasion by the officers and sailors, who, not seeing exactly what had happened, treated all the islanders they met as dangerous. Fortunately, concord was soon restored, and the relations were so friendly when the time came for the French to leave, that many of the natives begged to accompany them to France. "The intelligent account which these islanders gave of the vessels which had anchored in this archipelago," says the narrative, "convinced us that La Perouse had not visited any of these islands. They remembered perfectly every occasion upon which they had seen Captain Cook, and they indicated the intervals between his visits by the crops of yams, reckoning 2 in each year." It is true that their information, as far as it related to La Perouse, was in direct contradiction to the facts which Dumont d'Urville collected 36 years later, when Tamaha was queen. "I was anxious to know," he says, "if any Europeans had visited Tonga between Cook and D'Entrecasteaux. After a few moments' reflection, she explained to me very clearly that a few years before D'Entrecasteaux's visit, 2 large vessels, like his in every respect, carrying guns and many Europeans, had anchored off Anamuka, and remained there 6 days. They showed a white flag, quite unlike the English one. The strangers had been very friendly with the natives, and had had a house on the island, and entered into trade. She related that a native who had agreed to exchange a wooden bolster for a knife, was shot by an officer because he wanted to take back his merchandise when he had been paid for it. However, the incident had not broken the peace, because in that instance the native was in the wrong." Although it is impossible to suspect Dumont d'Urville of any attempted imposition, many portions of this circumstantial account bear the impress of truth, more especially that relating to the flag, as being different to that of the English. Must we then charge D'Entrecasteaux with want of thoroughness in his work? This would be a very serious charge. Yet 2 circumstances, which we shall presently relate, appear to point to that conclusion. The natives witnessed the departure of the French with keen regret. The expedition left upon the 21st Germinal, and 2 days later the Espérance signalled Erronan, the most easterly of the islands of Santo Espiritu, discovered by Quiros in 1660. Beyond this, Anatom, Tana, with its volcano in constant eruption, and the Boutem-Beaupré Islands were passed. Carried onwards by the currents, the vessels were soon in sight of the mountains of New Caledonia, and anchored in Balade Harbour, where Captain Cook had cast anchor in 1774. The natives were acquainted with the use of iron, but they did not appear to value it as highly as others had done, probably because the stones they used instead were very hard and answered admirably for their purposes. Their first demand upon going on board was for something to eat, and their need was unmistakable, for they pointed to their manifestly empty stomachs. Captain Cook had already remarked that they managed their pirogues, which were far less ingeniously constructed than those of the Friendly Islands, unskilfully. The greater number of these natives had woolly hair, and skins almost as black as those of the inhabitants of Van Diemen's Land. Their weapons were assegais and clubs, and in addition to these, they carried at the waist a little bag full of the oval stones which they throw from their slings. After a short excursion inland, during which they visited the huts of the natives, which were shaped like beehives, the officers and naturalists prepared to re-embark. "Upon returning to our boat," says the narrative, "we found more than 700 natives, who had assembled from all directions. They began by demanding stuffs and iron in exchange for their wares, and soon some of them proved themselves arrant thieves. I will mention one of their many manoeuvres. A man offered to sell me the little bag of stones which he carried at his waist. He unfastened it, and pretended to offer it to me in one hand, whilst he held out the other for the price upon which we had agreed. But at the same moment another native, who had taken up his stand behind me, uttered a shrill scream, which made me turn my head in his direction, whereupon the rogue made off with his bag, and hid himself in the crowd. We were unwilling to punish him, although most of us carried our guns. Unfortunately, our leniency might be regarded as a proof of our weakness, and so add to the native insolence; and an incident which shortly occurred indicates this was so. Some natives were bold enough to throw stones at an officer who was only about 200 paces away from us. We were still unwilling to act harshly, as we had heard so much in their favor from Forster's narrative, and had such confidence in their goodwill, that still more evidence was required to convince us of their real character. One of them, who was enjoying a broiled bone, and busily devouring the meat which still clung to it, offered a share of his meal to a sailor named Piron. He, thinking it to be the bone of some animal, accepted it, but before eating it showed it to me. I at once recognized that it had belonged to the body of a child, of probably 14 or 15 years of age. The natives crowding round us showed us upon a living child the position of the bone, owning without hesitation that the man had been making his meal off it, and giving us to understand that it was a great delicacy. Those of our company who had remained on board could hardly credit our account of this disgusting fact. They refused to believe that a people who had been so differently described by Captain Cook and Captain Forster could be capable of so degrading a practice, but the most incredulous were soon convinced. I had retained possession of the gnawed bone, and our surgeon at once recognized it as that of a child. To make still more sure of the cannibalism of the natives, I offered it to one of them. He seized it eagerly, and tore the remaining flesh from it with his teeth. After he had done with it, I passed it to another, who still found something upon it to relish." The natives who visited the vessel committed so many thefts, and became so impudent, that we were forced to drive them away. Upon landing next day the French found the natives feasting. They immediately offered a share of their meal to the strangers. It proved to be human flesh, recently cooked. Many of them even came close up to the French, and felt the muscles of their arms and legs, uttering the word "Karapek," with an expression of admiration and longing which was anything but reassuring. Many of the officers were assaulted and robbed with the greatest effrontery. There remained no doubt of the intentions of the natives. They even attempted to possess themselves of the hatchets the sailors had brought on shore to cut wood, and were only made to desist by being fired upon. These constantly recurring hostilities always ended in the repulse of the natives, many of whom were killed or wounded. But in spite of the repulses they met with, they let no favorable opportunity pass of recommencing their attacks. La Billardière was witness to a fact which has since been frequently observed, but was long disbelieved. He saw the natives eating steatite. This mineral substance serves to deaden the sense of hunger by filling the stomach and sustaining the viscera of the diaphragm, and although it contains no nourishment whatever, it is useful to them because they have long periods when food is scarcely procurable, as they bestow very little cultivation upon their land, which is naturally very sterile. Yet one would scarcely have expected hungry cannibals to resort to such an expedient. No news of La Perouse had been obtained during the stay in New Caledonia; but M. Jules Garnier states that a tradition exists of the appearance of two large ships, which had sent boats on shore, near the northern extremity of Pine Island. After the first alarm, says M. Jules Garnier, in a communication which appeared in the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie for November 1869, "the natives approached the strangers and fraternized with them. They were quite astonished at their riches, and their cupidity induced them to oppose the departure of the French sailors by force; but their ardor was moderated by a volley which killed a few of them. Little pleased with their reception, the French vessels proceeded to the mainland, after letting off a cannon, which the natives took to be a clap of thunder." It is strange that D'Entrecasteaux, who entered into communications with the natives of Pine Island, should have heard nothing of these events. The island is small, and its population has always been scanty. The natives must have kept secret the fact of their dealings with La Perouse. Had D'Entrecasteaux, in his navigation among the coral reefs which protect the eastern coast of New Caledonia, succeeded in entering one of the many openings he met with, he might have found some trace of the course taken by La Perouse, who was a careful navigator, and anxious to emulate Cook, who had touched at several points of that coast. A whaler, whose account is quoted by Rienzi, declared that he had seen medals, and a cross of St. Louis, relics of the French expedition, in possession of the natives of New Caledonia. M. Jules Garnier, during a voyage from Noumea to Canala, in March 1865, observed in the hand of one of their native escort "an old rusty sword, in the fashion of the last century," which bore the impression of the fleur de lis. He could obtain no account of it from its possessor, except that he had had it a long time. There is no evidence that any member of the expedition gave a sword, still less a cross of the order of St. Louis, to a savage. No doubt an officer had fallen in some encounter, and thus these articles had come into native hands. This hypothesis accords with M. Garnier's explanation of the contradictory accounts given by Cook and D'Entrecasteaux of the people of Balade. According to the former, they are peaceable, honest, and friendly. According to the latter, they are robbers, traitors, and cannibals. M. Jules Garnier suggests that some extraordinary event must have changed the disposition of the natives between the two visits. Most likely an encounter had taken place. The Europeans may have been driven to the use of arms; they may possibly have destroyed plantations and burnt huts. In such a case their hostile reception of D'Entrecasteaux would be explicable. La Billardière, in his account of an excursion to the mountains forming the watershed of the northern extremity of New Caledonia, and from which the sea can be seen on either side, says, "We were followed by 3 natives, who had no doubt seen us a year previously, when we coasted the eastern shores of their island, for before they left us they spoke of 2 ships which they had seen upon that coast." La Billardière ought to have pressed the natives upon this subject. Were the vessels seen by them those of La Perouse or of D'Entrecasteaux, and was it really a year previously? From these details we see how much it is to be regretted that D'Entrecasteaux did not pursue his investigations more zealously. No doubt, had he done so, he would have found traces of his fellow countrymen. We shall shortly see that with a little perseverance he would have found some at least, if not all of them, alive. During the stay in this port, Captain Huon de Kermadec succumbed to a hectic fever from which he had long been suffering. He was succeeded in the command of the Espérance by M. Desmeny d'Auribeau. Leaving New Caledonia upon the 21st Floréal, D'Entrecasteaux sighted successively Moulin and Huon Islands, and Santa Cruz de Mendana, which is separated from New Jersey by a strait, in which the French vessels were attacked by the natives. To the southeast D'Entrecasteaux observed an island, which he named after the Recherche, and which he might have called Discovery if he had approached it. It was Vanikoro, an islet surrounded by coral reefs, upon which La Perouse's vessels had been wrecked, and which at this time, in all probability, was inhabited by some of the unfortunate seamen. It was most unfortunate to be so near success, and yet to miss it. But the veil which hid the fate of La Perouse and his companions was not destined to be removed for a long time yet. After surveying the northern extremities of Santa Cruz, without any result so far as the object of his expedition was concerned, D'Entrecasteaux directed his course to de Surville's land of the Arsacides. He reconnoitred the northern coast, and thence reached the shores of Louisiade, which La Perouse had announced his intention of visiting when he left Salomon Island, and surveyed Cape Deliverance. Bougainville was wrong in supposing that this cape belonged to New Guinea. It is the extreme point of an island, called Rossel after one of the officers who has given an account of the expedition. After coasting along a series of low and rocky islands, which were named after the principal officers, the vessels reached Cape William, on the coast of New Guinea. They then directed their course to Dampier's Strait. After sailing along the northern coast of New Britain, several small and mountainous islands, hitherto unknown, were discovered. Upon the 17th of July a small island in the neighbourhood of the Anchorite Islands was sighted. D'Entrecasteaux had long been suffering from dysentery and scurvy, and was in extreme danger. Following the advice of his officers, he decided to take leave of the Espérance, and endeavoured to reach Waihoun more quickly. Upon the 20th of July he sunk under long and protracted sufferings. After a stay at Waihoun and Bouro Islands, at which latter place the president overwhelmed the French with civilities, and where Bougainville was still remembered by the natives, the expedition left, under command of D'Auribeau. He also unfortunately fell ill, and the command was transferred to Rossel, under whose orders the vessels passed first Boutong, and then Sallier Straits, and reached Sourabaya upon the 19th of October. Sad news here awaited the members of the expedition. Louis XVI had been beheaded. France was at war with Holland and all the European powers. Although both the Recherche and the Espérance needed many repairs, and the health of the crews needed repose, D'Auribeau was about to start for Mauritius, when he was detained by the French governor. Fearing that the news from Europe, affecting as it did the various members of the expedition so differently, might lead to disaffection in his colony, he subjected his prisoners, as he called the French, to most humiliating conditions, which they could not escape. Irritation and hatred were rampant, when it occurred to D'Auribeau to unfurl the white flag. However, the greater part of the officers and men of science, amongst them Billardière, obstinately refused to respect the conditions imposed, and being arrested by order of the Dutch authorities, were distributed throughout the different parts of the colony. After the death of D'Auribeau, which occurred upon the 21st of August, 1794, Rossel became head of the expedition. He undertook to convey all documents of every kind collected during the voyage to France; but being taken prisoner by an English frigate, he was deprived of his property, in defiance of justice; and when France obtained the objects of natural history of which she had been robbed, the expression is not too strong when we recall the instructions given by the French government with regard to Captain Cook's expedition, they were in so bad a condition that they had lost much of their value. Thus ended this unfortunate expedition. Although its principal object had not been attained, it had at least resulted in some geographical discoveries. It had completed or rectified those made by preceding navigators; and to it, especially to the exertions of La Billardière, are due the acquisition of an immense number of facts in natural history. Section 34.
Section 34 of Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Celebrated Travels and Travellers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 3. French Navigators. 3a. Captain Marchand's Voyage. The Marquesas. Discovery of Nuka Hiva. Manners and Customs of the Inhabitants. Revolution Islands. The Coast of America and Tchinkitané Port. Cook Strait. Stay at the Sandwich Islands. Macao. Disappointment. Return to France. Discoveries made by Bass and Flinders upon the Australian coast. Captain Baudin's expedition. Endracht and de Witt Islands. Stay at Timor. Survey of Van Diemen's Land. Separation between the Géographe and the Naturaliste. Stay at Port Jackson. Convicts. Agricultural wealth of New South Wales. Return of the Naturaliste to France. Cruise of the Géographe and of the Casuarina to the islands of Nuyts, Edels, Endracht, and de Witt. Second stay at Timor. Return to France. Etienne Marchand, a captain in the French service, returning to France from Bengal in 1788, met with the English Captain Portlock in the roadstead of St. Helena. Their conversation naturally fell upon commerce, and the value of various articles of trade. Like a sensible man, Marchand allowed his companion to talk, and only put in a few words himself now and again, and thus drew from Portlock the interesting information that furs, and more especially otter skins, which could be obtained for a mere trifle upon the eastern coast of North America, realized an enormous price in China, whilst at the same time a cargo brought from the Celestial Empire would return a large profit in Europe. Upon arriving in France, Marchand communicated what he had learned to his shipowners, Messieurs Baux of Marseilles, and they at once resolved to act upon the knowledge he had obtained. Navigation in the Pacific Ocean required a ship of special strength and excellent. Messieurs Baux ordered the construction of a vessel of 300 tons burden, plated with copper, and provided with every necessary for defence in case of attack, and for repairs in the event of accident, and also with everything likely to promote trade and to ensure the health of the crews during a voyage of 3 or 4 years. Two captains, Messieurs Masse and Prosper Chanal, were associated with Marchand in the command of the expedition, and the rest of the party consisted of 3 lieutenants, 2 surgeons, 3 volunteers, and a crew of 39 seamen. 4 cannon, 2 howitzers, 4 swivel guns with needful ammunition, etc., formed the equipment. Although the vessel was only to reach Cape Horn at the beginning of winter, the Solide left Marseilles upon the 14th of December, 1790. After a short stay at Praia, Cape Verde Islands, Marchand proceeded to Staten Island, which he reached upon the 1st of April, 1791. He then doubled Tierra del Fuego and entered the Pacific. His intention was to proceed immediately to the north-western coast of America, but at the beginning of May the water on board was already so tainted that he required a fresh supply. Under these circumstances the captain decided to reach the Marquesas Island of Mendoza, which are situated at south latitude 6° and near 141° west of the Paris meridian. The situation of these islands, says Fleuriot, who published an interesting account of this voyage, was the more suitable for his purpose, because, with a view to escaping the calms often met with in too easterly a course, he had resolved to cross the line at 142° west longitude. This group of islands had been discovered in 1595 by Mendoza, and visited by Cook in 1774. Magdalena Island, the most southerly of the group, was reached upon the 12th of June. The captain and his associate Chanal had calculated with such precision that the Solide anchored off the Mendoza Islands after a cruise of 73 days from the time of leaving Staten Island, without having noticed any land whatever. Constant astronomical observations alone ensured the safety of the vessel in a sea where the currents were unequal, and it was quite impossible to regulate the course of the ship by any ordinary calculations. Marchand made for San Pedro, which lay on the west. He soon recognized Dominica, Santa Cristina, and Hood Island, the most northerly of the group, and finally anchored in Madre de Dios Bay, where he was enthusiastically welcomed by the natives, crying "Tayo! Tayo!" Finding it impossible to obtain the number of pigs he required at this port, the captain decided upon visiting the remaining bays of Santa Cristina Island, which he found better populated, more fertile, and more picturesque than that of Madre de Dios. The stay of the English in the Marquesas Island had been too short to allow of accurate observations of the manners and customs of the inhabitants. We will therefore make a few extracts from the description given by Etienne Marchand. "These natives are tall, strong, and active. Their complexion is clear brown, but many differ little in this respect from the lower orders in Europe. The climate renders clothing unnecessary, but they tattoo their entire bodies so regularly, each arm and leg, for example, exactly like its fellow, that the effect is by no means bad. The way of arranging the hair varies, and fashion is as despotic in the Marquesas as in other countries. Some wear necklaces of red beads, others a string of small pieces of light wood. Although both men and women have their ears pierced, earrings are not usually worn. But a young native girl has been seen strutting about, wearing as a neck ornament the rusty iron shaving dish which she has stolen from the ship's barber, whilst a man was equally proud of sporting the ramrod of Captain Marchand's gun, which he had placed in the orifice of his ear, letting part of it hang down." Cook affirms that these islanders, like the Tahitans, were acquainted with kava. Certain it is, that they called the brandy which was offered them on the Solide by the name of the pepper plant. It appeared that they did not indulge to excess in this liquor, for none of them were ever seen in a state of drunkenness. The English did not mention in their account of the natives an act of civility, which Captain Chanal thought worthy of special record. It consisted in offering to a friend a piece of food which had been already chewed, that he might have no trouble but that of swallowing it. We may easily imagine that the French, in spite of their appreciation of the good will conveyed in this action, were little likely to avail themselves of it. To Marchand we also owe the curious observation that their huts are raised upon flat stones, and that the stilts which they use indicate that Santa Cristina is subject to inundations. In the exhibition at the Trocadero, one of these stilts, extremely well made and carved, was exhibited; and Monsieur Ami, whose thorough knowledge of everything relating to Oceania is well known, has written an essay upon this singular object. Beyond the usual occupations of fishing, the construction of their weapons, pirogues, and domestic implements, the natives of Santa Cristina pass their time in singing, dancing, and amusing themselves. The common expression of "killing time" seems to have been invented to mark the uselessness of the actions which make up their lives. During the earlier days of the stay in Madre de Dios Bay, Marchand had observed something which led him to the discovery of a group of islands hitherto unknown to the older navigators or to Cook. Upon a clear evening at sunset he noticed a spot upon the horizon which had the appearance of a lofty peak. As this appeared several nights in succession, he concluded that it was land, and finding it not mentioned upon any of the charts, it seemed probable that it was some unknown island. Marchand determined to satisfy himself upon this point, and leaving Santa Cristina upon the 20th of June, he had the satisfaction of discovering a group of small islands in the northwest, which were situated in 7 degrees of latitude. He gave his own name to the most important of them. The natives were evidently of the same race as that which peopled the Marquesas. Shortly afterwards several other islands were discovered, including Beau Island, which is identical with Nuka Hiva, the Deux Frères, and Masse and Chanal Islands. This group, since united by geographers to that of the Marquesas, received the name of Revolution Islands. The course was then directed to the American coast. It was too late in the season to attempt to reach William Sound or Cook's River on the 6th parallel. Marchand accordingly resolved upon making for Engano Cape, and entering the Norfolk Bay of Dixon, which is identical with the Guadaloupe Bay of the Spaniards. Upon the 7th of August Engano Cape was sighted, and after 5 days of calm, anchor was cast in Guadaloupe Bay. There had not been a single case of scurvy on board, after 242 days' navigation, 10 of which only were passed in port, at Praya and Madre de Dios, and after traversing some 5,800 leagues of sea. This was certainly a wonderful fact, due to the provision of the ship owners, who had spared nothing that could conduce to the health of the crews, and also to the care with which the captains had observed the sanitary measures commended to them by experience. During his stay in this port, which the natives called Tchinkitané, Marchand bought a number of otter skins, 100 of which were of the very first quality. The natives are ugly, stunted, but well proportioned. They have round, flat faces, small, sunken, bleared eyes, and prominent cheekbones, which do not add to their beauty. It is difficult to define the colour of their skins, so carefully is it disguised under a thick coating of grease, and the black and red substances which they rub in. Their hair is coarse, thick, and bushy, covered with ochre, down, and all the filth accumulated by time and neglect, and adds not a little to their unprepossessing appearance. The women, though not so black as the men, are even more ugly. They are short and thick set, their feet turn inwards, and their incredibly filthy habits make them repulsive. The coquetry which is innate in the female mind induces them to add to their natural charms by the use of a labial ornament, as ugly as it is inconvenient, of which we have already spoken in our account of Captain Cook's stay in these waters. By means of an incision just below the lower lip, they make an opening parallel to that of the mouth, into which they insert an iron or wooden skewer, and from time to time they gradually increase the size of the instrument, in accordance with advancing age. Finally, they introduce a piece of wood, made for the purpose, to the size and shape of the bowl of an ordinary tablespoon. This ornament, weighing upon the projecting part, naturally forces down the lower lip upon the chin, and develops the beauty of a large gaping mouth, in shape not unlike an oven, revealing a row of dirty yellow teeth. This bowl is removable at pleasure, and when it is absent the opening of the lower lip presents the appearance of a second mouth, which is a little smaller than the natural one, and in some cases has been known to be 3 inches in length. The Solide left Tchinkitané upon the 21st of August, and steered to the southeast, in the hope of coming upon Queen Charlotte's Islands, which had been discovered in 1786 by La Pérouse. These islands extend over a distance of nearly 70 leagues. Upon the 23rd, Etienne Marchand sighted Manteau Bay (Dixon's Cloak Bay), which was carefully surveyed by Captain Chenal. Next day the vessels entered Cook Strait, and began to trade with the Indians for furs. The navigators were immensely astonished at seeing 2 enormous paintings, evidently of great age, and some gigantic sculptures, which, although not bearing the very smallest comparison to the chef d'oeuvre of Greece, testified none the less to artistic tastes little to be expected from the miserable population. The lands which form Cook Strait and Bay are low and covered with furs. The soil, composed of the remains of plants and broken rocks, does not appear to have much depth, and the productions are similar to those of Tchinkitané. The population may be estimated at 400. Not unlike Europeans in height and figure, they are less hideous than the Tchinkitaneans. This stay in Cloak Bay was not as productive of trade in furs as Marchand had expected, and he therefore decided to send an expedition under Captain Chenal to the more southerly islands. The object of the expedition was the survey of the regions which had hitherto been unvisited. Dixon was the only navigator who had crossed these waters, and none of his crew had landed. It is therefore not astonishing that many of his assertions were either rectified or denied after this more careful exploration. After sighting Nootka Sound, Berkeley Bay was reached, but just as the Solide was about to enter it, a 3-masted ship was seen approaching the harbour from the south, which was precisely what Marchand had intended doing. This decided the French navigator to proceed immediately to the coast of China, and dispose of his merchandise before the vessel he now saw should have time to reach it and compete with him. The best route to follow was that of the Sandwich Islands, and upon the 5th of October the heights of Mauna Loa and Mauna Koa were made out by the French. They seemed quite free from snow, which was contrary to the description given of them by Captain King. So soon as Owhyee Island was in sight, Marchand wisely decided to conduct all his trade on board. He obtained pigs, fowls, cocoanuts, bananas, and various fruits from this island, and was delighted at finding amongst them pumpkins and watermelons, no doubt from the seeds sown by Captain Cook. 4 days were passed in trade, then the route to China was resumed, and in due course Tinian Island, one of the Marianas, was sighted. Commodore Anson's glowing description of this island will be recalled. Byron, as we have already mentioned, was quite astonished at the different aspect it presented to him. But the fact is, some 50 years earlier Tinian was flourishing, and counted 30,000 inhabitants, and the victorious Spaniards had since introduced an epidemic which had decimated the population, whilst the miserable survivors had been torn from their country and sent to Guam as slaves. Marchand did not land at Tinian, which, according to the accounts of every navigator who had visited it since Byron, had relapsed into barbarism, but made for the southern extremity of Formosa. Reaching Macao upon the 28th of November, he heard news which disconcerted him. The Chinese government had just passed a law prohibiting the introduction of furs into the ports of the empire under most severe penalties. Was this the result of some unknown clause in a secret treaty with Russia, or was it due to the cupidity and avarice of a few mandarins? In either case it was impossible to infringe the law. Marchand wrote to Messrs. Baux's agents in Canton, but the same prohibition held good in that town also, and it was useless to think of reaching Whampoa, where he would have to pay a duty, amounting to at least 6,000 piastres. The only course open to Marchand was to go to Mauritius, and thence return to Marseilles. It is unnecessary to describe the return voyage, which was accomplished without any unusual incidents. What were the scientific results of this expedition? Nothing to speak of, from a geographical point of view. They may be enumerated as follows: the discovery of that portion of the Marquesas Island which had escaped the notice of Captain Cook and his predecessors, a more thorough examination of the country, and the manners and customs of the natives of Santa Cristina in the same group, of Tchinkitané and Cloak Bays, and of Queen Charlotte's Islands off the American coast. Small as these results might appear for an official expedition, they were not unsatisfactory for a vessel equipped by private enterprise. Moreover, Captain Marchand and his colleagues had turned new discoveries to such good account, and studied the narratives of earlier voyages so carefully, that they carried out the plan of their expedition more precisely than many experienced navigators might have done, and, in their turn, they rendered valuable assistance to their successors by the accuracy of their charts and drawings. Circumstances were to prove less favourable for the publication of an account of a scientific expedition undertaken some years later under the auspices of the French government, having for its object the survey of the Australian coast. Although the results of the voyage made by Nicolas Baudin were most abundant, they seem up to this date to have been little recognised, and scientific dictionaries and biographies say as little as possible of his expedition. From the time of Tasman's discovery of the western coast of New Holland, much had been done towards exploring this immense continent. Cook had carefully surveyed the eastern coast, discovering Endeavour Strait, and had urged upon his government the great advantages which would accrue from the founding of a colony in Botany Bay. In 1788 Philip, with his band of convicts, had laid the foundation of Port Jackson and of English power in its fifth continent of the world. In 1795 and 1796 Flinders, a midshipman, and Surgeon Bass, with a small vessel called the Tom Thumb, had explored 20 miles of the River George, and made a careful survey of a long stretch of coast. In 1797 Bass discovered a large harbour which he named Western Port on account of its situation. His provisions were now exhausted, says Desborough Cooley, and in spite of his earnest wish to make an accurate and minute survey of his new discoveries, he was obliged to retrace his steps. He was only provided with provisions for 6 weeks; still, by aid of fish and sea birds, which he obtained in abundance, he succeeded in extending his voyage for another 5 weeks, although he had taken on board 2 convicts whom he had picked up. This voyage of 600 miles in an open boat is one of the most remarkable on record. It was not undertaken from necessity, but with the view of exploring unknown and dangerous shores. In 1798 Bass, accompanied by Flinders, discovered the strait which now bears his name, and which divides Tasmania from New Holland; and in a schooner of some 25 tons burden he made the tour of Van Diemen's Land. These brave adventurers collected facts and made observations of the rivers and ports of this country, which were of great use in the future colonization of the continent. Bass and Jackson were both enthusiastically received at Port Jackson. Upon his return to England, Flinders received command of the Investigator, with the rank of naval lieutenant. This vessel was especially equipped for a voyage of discovery upon the Australian coast. The south and northwestern shores, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and Torres Straits were to be explored. Section 35